The stairwell door hit the concrete wall and the sound echoed through 3 levels of parking structure. Cold air and motor oil, and the particular dark of a place where the fluorescent lights had been installed at minimum density to technically qualify as lit. Cass Merrow, 26 years old. Accounts clerk finishing her 9th month at the Meridian Hotel Group, had just run down 3 flights of stairs in low heels because the elevator required a key card she had handed back to the front desk 17 minutes ago when Vincent Doyle told her she no longer had a position at this company. And because Vincent Doyle was now on level 3 behind her, every car in this structure was locked. Nobody else was here. She turned the corner toward the exit ramp and stopped. 2 men she did not know were standing at the base of the ramp, not blocking it with intent, standing the way people stand when they are waiting for something specific and are not in a hurry about it. The one on the left was built like a door frame and had his hands in his jacket pockets and was not looking at her. The one on the right was taller, leaner, with a face that was neither warm nor cold, but entirely present. The face of someone who had spent considerable time in rooms where reading the air correctly was the difference between leaving and not leaving. He looked at her the way she would later understand. He looked at everything not as a threat, not as irrelevant, but as information. She heard the stairwell door open behind her. Cass Merrow, who had spent 6 months absorbing Vincent Doyle's particular brand of escalating pressure, who had stayed late when he asked, and revised documents twice when he found reasons to find fault, and absorbed the hand on her shoulder and the hand on her wrist and the voice too low for anyone else to hear, who had done all of this because she needed this job and had no one she could tell who could change anything, stopped running and stood still, not because she was brave, because she had just done the math, and the math said the exit was blocked, and the man behind her was the known danger, and the 2 men ahead of her were the unknown kind. And her whole nervous system had finally exceeded its capacity for the specific fear of Doyle and had shifted into a different register entirely. Still afraid, but in a different way, a cleaner way. Vincent Doyle came around the corner from the stairwell and stopped when he saw the 2 men. He was 51 years old, and had the particular confidence of a man who had learned that most situations resolved in his favor if he was willing to be more unpleasant than the other person. He looked at the 2 men. He looked at Cass. He said, "This is a private matter." The taller man at the base of the ramp did not move. He did not speak. He simply adjusted his attention from Cass to Doyle, and the quality of that attention was such that Doyle took 1 step back that he almost certainly did not intend to take. Cass saw that and catalogued it. She catalogued everything. It was the only skill she had developed in the past 6 months that felt like an asset instead of a wound. What happened in the next 4 minutes, she would later reconstruct from the pieces she had been able to observe, because some of it was fast, and some of it happened at angles she could not see. The taller man spoke to Doyle in a voice too quiet to carry. Doyle said something that contained the word lawyers. The taller man said something that was shorter than whatever Doyle said. Doyle's posture changed. It changed the way a structure changes under load when the load exceeds its engineering tolerance. Not a dramatic collapse, but a series of small, visible adjustments. By the end of 4 minutes, Vincent Doyle walked back through the stairwell door, and the stairwell door closed, and the parking structure was quiet. The taller man looked at Cass. He said, "You don't have a car here." It was not a question. She had taken the bus. Of course he knew that. She looked back at him and noticed, for the first time, a 3rd man she had not registered before, standing 10 feet behind the 2 at the ramp, near the support column at the southeast corner. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 40s, with a face that had settled into a specific kind of blankness, the blankness of someone who has trained himself to show nothing as a default operating mode. He was looking at her, not at the taller man. At her. When her eyes found his, he did not look away. He just kept looking, with an attention that did not feel hostile, but did not feel comfortable either. The taller man said, "Come with us." She looked back at him. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the alternative is standing here alone, and Doyle hasn't left the building." She thought about that for exactly the length of time it took to determine that it was accurate. She said, "Where?" He said, "Somewhere you can sit down." She picked up her bag from where it had fallen against the wall when she stopped running. She walked with them toward the exit. His name was Ren Salas. She did not know that for another 40 minutes, until they were in a car that was not the kind of car she had ever been in before, and he handed her a bottle of water from the console and said his name. The way people say things they have said many times, in many rooms, and have long since stopped assigning weight to. She was sitting in the back seat, and he was in the front, and the city was moving past the windows in the particular way. Cities move past car windows at night. All the light smeared sideways. She drank the water. She had stopped shaking somewhere on the parking ramp, which she noted because she had not noticed when it happened. She asked him what he said to Vincent Doyle. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I told him that filing a complaint about what happened in that parking structure would require him to describe what he was doing in that parking structure." She thought about that. It was a specific kind of logic, clean and pressurized, that used the truth as a lever rather than a weapon. And she recognized the efficiency of it in the way you recognize something you have wished existed but did not know how to build. She said, "And what do you want from me?" He looked at the road. He said, "I want to know whether you can read a set of books that don't match." She looked at the back of his head. She said, "I've been reading books that don't match for 9 months. That's how I kept my job for 9 months." He said nothing. She watched the city continue to move past the window and thought about the man at the southeast column with the blankness trained into his face and the way he had looked at her. Not at Ren, not at the situation, specifically at her, with the attention of someone filing information for later use. They pulled up outside a building near the port, a commercial property that looked like a shipping logistics office from the outside, and was, as she would later understand, exactly that, from the outside. Ren got out, and she got out, and he held the door for her in the way that had nothing to do with manners and everything to do with the fact that the door was heavy, and he was closer to it. Inside was a reception area with a desk that was unstaffed at this hour, and a hallway and the smell of paper and sea air. He walked her to an office on the 2nd floor and told her to sit and brought her coffee without asking whether she wanted it, which was a small thing and also somehow not a small thing at all. After a day that had started at 7 in the morning and ended with her running down a parking structure stairwell, he sat across from her and told her what he needed. An accountant for the internal books of Salas Shipping and its 3 subsidiary companies. Legal work only, he said, which was either true or the kind of thing you said first. He said the person he had before had left under circumstances he did not detail, and the books had not been reconciled for 11 weeks. He said the position paid 3 times what she had been making at the Meridian Group, and included housing in a building the company owned 6 blocks from the port. He said she could leave at any time. He said the only rules were, do the work assigned. Do not ask about operations that did not intersect with the books. And if she found anything unusual in the numbers, she brought it to him directly and no one else. He said that last rule with a specificity that was different from the other 2. She heard the difference. She said, "What kind of unusual?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "The kind you can't explain with ordinary error." She held his gaze. She said, "What happened to the last person who found something unusual?" He said, "Nothing. There was no last person who found something unusual. That is why I need someone who will." She thought about that. She thought about 11 weeks of unreconciled books and what that meant in a company that handled the volume of freight she had seen referenced on the intake paperwork, visible on the desk. She thought about the rule that said, "Bring it to him directly, and no one else." She thought about the man at the southeast column. She said, "I'll need access to the full ledger system, not just the reconciliation layer." He said, "You'll have it by morning." She said, "And I'll need the previous person's work, whatever exists of it." He said, "It will be on your desk." She looked at the coffee. She looked at the room. She said, "All right." He nodded once. He stood. He said, "Someone will take you to the apartment tonight." She stood also. She picked up her bag. She said, "Mr. Salas." He looked at her. She said, "You haven't told me what you want from these books. What outcome?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The truth. That's all I ever want from numbers." She held that for a moment. She walked to the door. She had no reason to believe him. She also had no reason not to. Yet, the apartment was on the 6th floor of a building that smelled like salt and had a window that faced the port. She stood at that window for a long time on her first morning, watching the container ships move through the channel at the speed of very large things, which was slower than you expected and more powerful than it looked. She had slept in the clothes she arrived in and had woken at 5:47 without an alarm, which was how she always woke when something large had just changed, her body refusing the idea that unconsciousness was appropriate. The apartment was clean and furnished in a way that suggested someone had chosen everything for function rather than preference. Dark wood and good lighting, and a kitchen stocked with basics. She made coffee and stood at the window and thought about what she had agreed to. She had agreed to read books that did not match. For a man whose name she had learned 40 minutes after he had removed the most immediate threat from her life, in an office that smelled like sea air and paper, for 3 times the salary she had been making before. She had no contract. She had no documentation. She had a coffee maker that worked, and a view of the port, and a job description that contained exactly one rule she had not heard from any employer before: bring anomalies directly to him. Not to HR, not to a supervisor, to him. She was a trained accountant, and she knew what that rule meant about the nature of what she might find. And she had agreed to it anyway, because the alternative versions of her evening had all ended worse than this one. She arrived at the Salas shipping offices at 8 in the morning, and a woman named Petra, 40-something, efficient in the way of someone who had been efficient for a long time and had stopped requiring acknowledgement for it, showed her to a workstation in a room on the 2nd floor that had 2 other desks, both empty. Petra brought her a login for the accounting system and a password on a slip of paper that she was expected to change immediately, which Cass did, and a paper folder containing the previous reconciler's work. The folder was thin. 11 weeks of books, and the output was thin. She opened it and understood immediately. The previous person had not left because they found something. They had left because they had stopped looking. She spent the first day doing what she always did with a new set of books, building the map before examining any single transaction. Total, volume, in, total, volume, out, category distribution, variance flags, the shape of the thing before the details. Salas Shipping was a legitimate operation by every metric she could see in the first pass. It moved freight. It charged for moving freight. It paid taxes on the revenue from moving freight. And the margins were consistent with what you would expect from a company that had been doing this for 11 years in a competitive market. She noted this. She also noted that the consistency was very good, almost too good, in the way that things are sometimes too clean because someone has decided that clean is what they want you to see. On the 3rd day, Ren Salas came into the room, not to check on her. He was passing through on the way to something else and stopped in the doorway and looked at what was on her screen. She did not minimize it. She had nothing to hide, and hiding things was not a reflex she had kept from the Meridian group. He looked at the variance distribution chart she had been building for the past 2 hours and said, "What does that tell you?" She said, "That your freight volumes are more stable than any legitimate shipping company's volumes have any reason to be." He looked at the chart for another moment. He said, she said, "And I don't know yet what's making them stable, but something is." He looked at her. He said, "Keep going." He left. She kept going. On the 4th day, she found the invoices. Not all of them at once. The first one appeared in a batch of routine Port Authority payments, a line item for warehouse storage at a facility designated only by a code, not a name or address, and the code did not match any of the facility codes in the asset register she had been given on day 1. She pulled the next invoice batch, another code, different from the first, same absence in the register. She pulled 6 months of invoice batches and found 9 separate facility codes that appeared nowhere in any official asset documentation. Each of them was billed monthly. Each of them was a consistent amount. And each of them was signed off not by the accounts department, but by a single set of initials, D.M. She sat with that for a while. She was a woman who had learned, in 9 months of working for Vincent Doyle, that the space between what you know and what you say is sometimes the most important space in a room. She knew what the initials meant. She had been introduced to Declan Merrow on her 2nd day, when he had passed through the main corridor with 2 other men, and Petra had said his name in the particular way. People say names that mean a position rather than a person. He was the operational head. He handled everything that moved. He was, Petra had said, the reason the company ran the way it ran. He was also, Cass now understood, the only person in this company whose work was not reviewed by anyone else, because reviewing Declan Merrow's work would have implied a lack of trust in Declan Merrow, and no one in this building implied that. She printed the 9 invoices. She put them in a folder. She did not bring them to Ren that day. She had told herself she needed one more pass to confirm what she was seeing was what she was seeing, because she had a rule. She had given herself in the first year of her career and never present a finding until you are sure enough to defend it under pressure. From any angle, at any speed. She was not there yet. She told herself this. She also knew, sitting at the desk with the folder in the drawer, that part of the reason she was not moving yet was that she had not fully worked out what moving would set in motion. And she was a woman who had spent the past year learning the cost of being in motion in a situation she did not fully understand. That evening, Ren was in the corridor when she left, not waiting for her, walking in the same direction at the same time, which was either coincidence or the specific version of not coincidence that looked like coincidence. He held the elevator door. She stepped in. He looked at the floor numbers and said, without looking at her, "You found something." She looked at the numbers also. She said, "I found several things. I need one more day to understand what they connect to." He said, "All right." The elevator opened. She stepped out. She said, "Mr. Salas." He looked at her from the elevator, the doors beginning to close. She said, "The initials D.M. Do they mean what I think they mean?" He held the doors with one hand. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. The specific shift of someone receiving information that confirms what they suspected and are not glad to have confirmed. He said, "Come to my office at 7 tomorrow morning." The doors closed. She walked the 6 blocks to the port apartment in the October evening. The air coming off the water with the particular weight of air that has traveled a long distance and arrived slightly altered by the journey. She thought about Declan Merrow standing in the corridor on her 2nd day, the broad shoulders and the trained blankness of his face. She thought about the southeast column in the parking structure on the first night, the way he had looked at her with the specific attention of someone filing information for later use. She thought about 9 invoices signed with his initials for facilities that did not officially exist. She thought about the man who ran the operations of this company, who had been trusted with everything that moved, who had been trusted so completely that the trust had become invisible. The way structural elements become invisible once you stop noticing they are load-bearing. She let herself into the apartment and made dinner from the basics in the kitchen, because she had a rule about eating when things were complicated, which was that you ate anyway. And then she sat at the small table by the port window with the food and the evening view and thought about what she was going to say at 7 in the morning. She thought about the rule, bring it to him directly and no one else. She had honored that rule. She had not spoken to anyone. She had not asked Petra. She had not referenced the codes in any system search that would generate a log. She had printed the invoices from a terminal that was not networked to the general system, because she had noticed on day 2 that the room had 2 network access points and one of them was isolated, and she had chosen it. She had not done this because she was strategic. She had done it because she was careful, which was a habit so old she had stopped noticing she had it. She washed the dishes. She stood at the window. The container ships were still moving through the channel in the dark, lit from above and from the water, slow and enormous and indifferent to everything happening on land. She had been in this city for 4 days. 3 months ago, she had been standing at a hotel reception desk, watching a man with his back to the security camera, speaking to someone he should not have been speaking to. And she had handled an entirely unrelated situation loudly enough and thoroughly enough that the security camera stayed pointed at her for the next 4 minutes and at nothing else. She had not known she was protecting anyone. She had been managing a guest complaint about a room with a broken air conditioning unit. She had not known anyone was watching. She still did not know that the man at the southeast column had been that man's superior, or that the reason she was sitting in this apartment 6 blocks from the port had begun in that hotel lobby 3 months ago. In a moment, she had already mostly forgotten. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. She set an alarm for 6, because she needed an hour to think before the 7 o'clock conversation, and because she had learned a long time ago that the most important hour before any difficult meeting was the one you spent alone, before anyone else was in the room. Ren was already in his office when she arrived at 6:58, not behind the desk, standing at the window the way she had seen him stand twice before, looking at something outside that was either the port or the idea of the port. His back to the door, his coffee on the sill. He heard her come in and did not turn immediately, which told her either that he trusted who was in the building at this hour, or that he had been expecting her and had let the sound confirm it, rather than turning to check. She sat in the chair across from his desk. She put the folder on the surface between them. He turned, looked at the folder, looked at her, and came to sit across from her. He did not touch the folder. She opened it herself and laid the invoices out in the order she had organized them, which was chronological within each facility code, and then grouped by code, so that the pattern was visible at a glance without requiring explanation. She said, 9 facility codes. 18 months of consistent monthly payments. None of the facilities appear in the asset register, the property portfolio, or any subsidiary documentation I have access to. She tapped the column of initials on the right side of each invoice, all signed by the same person. He looked at the invoices. He was quiet for longer than she expected. She had learned in 4 days that Ren Salas's silences were not the same as other people's silences. They were not uncomfortable. They were working silences. The silence of someone processing at a speed that did not require narration. He said, "How did you find these?" She said, "They were in the invoice batches with the port authority payments. Whoever entered them into the system categorized them as port storage costs, which is a high-volume line item. In a busy reconciliation period, they would read as noise in a large category." She paused. The previous reconciler never ran a cross-reference between the facility codes in the invoices and the facility codes in the asset register. I ran it on day 3. He looked at her. "Why day 3? She said. "Because day 1 I was building the overall map, and day 2 I was verifying the map was complete. Cross-referencing specific line items against the asset register is a day 3 task if you are being thorough. If you are not being thorough, it is a task you never do," he said. "The previous reconciler was not thorough," she said. "The previous reconciler was paid not to be thorough, or paid to be thorough about everything except this. I cannot tell you which from the documentation I have." He was quiet again. She waited. He reached across the desk and picked up the first invoice and looked at it for a long moment. At the facility code, at the amount, at the initials in the lower right corner. She watched him look at it and saw what was happening in his face. The specific cost of recognizing a betrayal you had been given no reason to expect, which was different from the cost of recognizing one you had suspected. She had seen that expression before, on different faces, in different offices, and it was always the same in its essential shape, the moment when the architecture of trust becomes visible as architecture because something inside it has failed. He set the invoice down. He said, "The 7th facility." He said it without looking at her. She said, "What about it?" He said, "The 7th code. Pull it separately." She pulled it from the stack and placed it in front of him. He looked at the address field, which was blank like all the others, and then at the amount, which was larger than the others by a factor that was not consistent with simple warehouse space. He said, "That one is not a warehouse." She waited. He said, "It is a loading facility on the south side of the port. One of 3 that can accommodate the kind of cargo that does not go through standard Port Authority inspection channels." She looked at the invoice. She looked at him. She said, "Because," he said, "because the cargo is not the kind that passes standard inspection." His voice was level, and she understood, from the levelness, the full weight of what that meant. She put the invoice back in the stack. She said, "There are 2 categories of thing that require that kind of facility. One of them is less dangerous than the other." He said, "Yes." She said, "Which one is this?" He looked at the window. He said, "The more dangerous one." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the port was running its morning operations, cranes moving and trucks moving, and the constant low hydraulic sound of a facility that did not have a natural rest state. She said, "How long has this been happening?" He said, "Based on the invoices, 18 months. Based on what I know about Declan Merrow's operational capacity, possibly longer, with earlier payments routed through a different channel that we have not yet found." She noticed the "we" in that sentence. She did not comment on it. She also noticed that she did not want to comment on it, and that the not wanting was itself information about where she was in relation to this situation. She said, "He will know the invoices have been found. If he monitors access logs on the system, he will see that someone ran a cross-reference between invoice codes and the asset register. He did not do it himself to be found." Ren looked at her. He said, "You ran the cross-reference from the isolated terminal." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a beat. He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I noticed on day 2 that the room has 2 network access points and one is isolated from the general log system. I chose it because it was a cleaner data environment for the kind of work I was doing." He looked at her for a long moment in the way he sometimes looked at her, as if he was verifying something he had already calculated. He said, "You did that without knowing what you were going to find." She said, "I did it because it was correct practice, not because I knew I needed to." He nodded once. He said, "Then he does not know yet." She said, "Not from the system logs. He may know from other channels. I cannot account for those." He said, "I can." He stood. He went to the window and looked at the port, and she looked at his back and thought about the architecture of trust again, about what it looked like from the outside when the person inside it was still processing what the failure meant. She said, "What do you need me to do?" He turned around. He said, "I need you to find the 7th warehouse, not from the invoices. Those give us the code, but not the physical location. I need an address." She said, "The payment routing. If the payments leave the company accounts and go somewhere before they reach the facility, the routing will have a geographic anchor." He said, "Can you trace that?" She said, "It will take me most of today, and I will need read access to the outgoing wire records for the last 18 months. He crossed to his desk and picked up his phone and typed something and set it back down. He said, "You have it now." She stood. She picked up her folder. She said, "Mr. Salas." He looked at her. She said, "When I find the address." "Then what?" He said, "Then we go there." She looked at him. She said, "We." He said, "You found this. You understand the financial architecture better than anyone I can send instead. And I need someone at the location who can identify on site whether the documentation there matches the payment structure you have built." She said, "That is not a job description I was given on day 1. He said, "No, it is a job description that exists because of what you did on day 3. She held his gaze. She said, "All right." She went back to her office. She spent the rest of the morning tracing the payment routing and found the anchor by early afternoon. A shell entity registered in Delaware that received the warehouse payments before routing them to a management company with a physical address in the Port District, 12 blocks south of where she was sitting. She printed the routing chain as a diagram, each entity in sequence, the amounts and the dates, the shape of a financial structure built specifically to obscure its own source, while leaving the payments themselves traceable if you started from the right end and worked backward. It was, she thought, a competent structure, not brilliant, competent, built by someone who understood enough about financial concealment to make it non-obvious but not enough to make it invisible, and who had relied on no one looking from the right end. She brought the diagram to Ren at 3 in the afternoon. He looked at it for 2 minutes without speaking, tracing the chain with one finger without touching the paper. He said, 12 blocks south. She said, the management company's registered address. The physical facility could be anywhere in the Port District, but the management company will have records, he said, or they will not have records, and the facility will be the record. She said, yes. He said, tomorrow night. We go at 11. She said, why not tonight? He said, because Declan has a meeting here at 6 this evening that I scheduled this morning after our conversation, and I need to watch him in a room for an hour before I go to his warehouse. She understood what he meant by watch, which was not observe for pleasure, but read. The way you read a structure under load to identify where the stress is concentrated. She said, what do I do at 6? He said, go home. Be in this building at 10:45 tomorrow night. She said, dressed how? He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted by the fraction that she had learned to read as the closest he came to warmth without producing the word. He said, practically. She said, all right. She went home. She ate dinner at the window table. She watched the container ships and thought about what practically meant in the context of going to a weapons storage facility at 11 at night with a man who ran a criminal organization and whose operational second-in-command had been building a private arms trafficking network inside the company's infrastructure for 18 months. She did not sleep well, but she slept, which was more than she had expected of herself, and she took it as evidence that whatever she was now, she was not the same person who had run down a parking structure stairwell 6 days ago in low heels, with nowhere to go. Declan Merrow sat down in the chair across from Ren's desk at 6:03 in the evening and looked like a man who had been doing this for 20 years, which was accurate. He was broad and unhurried and his hands rested on his knees with the stillness of someone who had long since stopped using body language to communicate anything he had not decided to communicate. He said, "Good evening." Ren said, "Good evening." The two of them looked at each other the way people look at each other when they have known each other long enough that the looking contains everything prior, which in this case was 22 years, beginning in a place Cass would not learn the details of until much later. She was not in the room. She was home. But Ren was in the room, and he was watching Declan the way he had told her he intended to watch him, reading the structure under load, looking for the place where the stress had concentrated and was beginning to show. Declan did not show it. That was the thing about Declan Merrow, which Ren understood by the end of the first 10 minutes of the meeting. He had lived with the weight of this for 18 months, and he had internalized it so completely that it had become part of his baseline, the way a chronic pain becomes part of how a person moves. There was no acute stress response because the stress was not acute. It had been present for so long that he had rebuilt his entire operating manner around it. Ren asked him about 3 shipments scheduled for the following month. Declan talked about the shipments in the flat technical language he always used: logistics and tonnage and port window timing, and his voice did not change, and his hands did not change, and the meeting was, from the outside, exactly what it appeared to be. Ren watched all of this and understood that he was not going to find what he needed by watching Declan. He was going to find it at the warehouse. Cass did not know about the second part of the meeting. At 6:47, after Declan had left, a man named Ortega, who handled intelligence for the family, brought Ren a file. The file contained a photograph taken that afternoon in the Port District, and the photograph showed Cass Merrow entering the building that housed the Delaware Shell entity's registered management company, 6 blocks south of the Salas shipping offices. She was not carrying the folder with the invoices. She was carrying nothing. The photograph was time-stamped at 2:14 in the afternoon, which was after she had found the anchor, and before she had brought the diagram to Ren at 3. She had gone there on her own, in the interval between finding the address and reporting it. Ortega did not have information on what happened inside the building, only that she had gone. Ren looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at the timestamp. He thought about the sequence. She found the address at some point in the early afternoon. She went to the building. She returned to the office. She brought him the diagram. He thought about the diagram, which was detailed and accurate and presented in a way that showed she understood the full architecture of what she had found. He thought about the isolated terminal and the invoice cross-reference and the way she had said, "I did it because it was correct practice, not because I knew I needed to." He thought about 3 months ago, in a hotel lobby, a woman managing a guest complaint with a quality of attention that he had recognized as rare and had filed away. He thought about Vincent Doyle in a parking structure and the way she had not moved, had not run, had stood still and done the math. He thought about all of this, and then he looked at the photograph again, at the building she had entered at 2:14 in the afternoon, before coming back to give him a complete and accurate diagram of the payment routing, and he could not make those two things fit together cleanly. He tried. They did not fit. He said to Ortega, "Find out what she did inside that building." Ortega nodded and left. Ren put the photograph in the drawer and sat at his desk and looked at the port through the window and waited. Cass arrived at the building at 10:42 the following night, 3 minutes before she was supposed to. She was wearing dark trousers and a jacket and flat shoes, and she had her hair pulled back, which told him she had thought about what practically meant and had answered the question correctly. He did not say this. He said, "We need to talk before we go." She looked at him. He led her to his office. He closed the door. He put the photograph on the desk between them, face up, and watched her look at it. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the timestamp. She said, "You had someone following me." He said, "I had someone in the Port District." "You were in the Port District," she said. That is not the same thing as an answer, he said. No, it is not. He held her gaze. He said, What were you doing in that building? She looked at the photograph again, and then back at him and said, I went to verify the address before I brought you the diagram. I needed to confirm the management company was a real entity with a physical presence, not a mail drop. He said, You did not tell me you went. She said, I did not think it was necessary to report a verification step. I tell you what I find, not every step I took to find it. He said, In this case, the step matters. She was quiet for a moment. She said, Because someone could have been watching the building. He said, Yes. She said, Did Declan know I went there? He said, I don't know yet. She said, Is that why you are telling me this now, before we go? He looked at her. He said, I am telling you because there is a version of yesterday afternoon that I cannot rule out, and I need you to hear it from me directly, rather than find out it exists some other way. She said, What version? He said, The version where you knew what the building was before you found the invoices. The version where going there was not a verification step but a contact. She looked at him without moving. The room was quiet. Outside, the port was doing its nighttime operations. Quieter than the day but not silent. She said, You think I was sent here? He said, I think I have a photograph of you entering a building connected to Declan's operation on the same day you found the invoices. And I owe you the honesty of telling you what that photograph looks like from the outside. She held that for a long moment. She said, I went there because I needed to see whether the address was real. I went in because the door was open and there was a directory in the lobby, and I wanted to see whether the management company's name appeared on the directory. It did. I left. I came back and made the diagram and brought it to you at 3 in the afternoon. She paused. If I were sent here to protect Declan, I would not have found the invoices, or I would have found them and not told you. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the directness of someone who has said the true thing and is waiting for the other person to decide what to do with it. He said, I know. She said, Then why are we still talking about it? He said, Because I needed to hear you say it. In this room. Before we go to a building that Declan controls. She was quiet. Then she said, Is that how this works? You ask and you listen and you decide. He said, Yes. She said, And, he said, And I believe you. The room held that for a moment. She nodded once. The kind of nod that was not relieved, but was resolved. The nod of someone who has passed a test they did not want to take, but understood why it existed. She picked up her jacket from the chair and said, Then, let's go. They went in a car with 2 of Ren's men in the front, and the drive to the port district took 11 minutes and was quiet. She sat beside him in the back and looked at the city moving past and did not make conversation, which was the right thing to do, and he noticed it the way he noticed most things she did that were right in ways that were not obvious. The management company building was dark. They went in through a service entrance that one of Ren's men had opened 40 minutes before their arrival. Inside was a corridor and then a loading bay, and then a door that required a code, and one of his men had the code from a source he did not explain to her, and the door opened. Beyond it was the warehouse, and in the warehouse was what she had understood from the invoices would be there, but which was different to see as a physical thing, stacked in crates along the south wall, marked with cargo codes she recognized from the payment documentation, real and present, and exactly the weight of evidence she had been building toward from a ledger entry in a batch of Port Authority invoices 9 days ago. She walked along the wall and looked at the crates and did not touch them. She said, The documentation in the system matches what is here. He said, You can confirm that. She said, The facility code, the cargo volumes implied by the payment amounts, the routing timeline, they match. He said, That is what I needed. She turned and looked at him across the warehouse, across the evidence of 18 months of a betrayal that had been built inside his organization by the person he had trusted most to keep it running. And she said, "What happens now?" He said, "Now we leave. And then I make some calls." She said, "And Declan?" He said, "Declan will be told to meet me here at 6 in the morning." She looked at him. She said, "He will know something is wrong when he gets that call." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then he will run or he will prepare." He said, "Yes." She said, "Which do you think he will do?" He looked at the crates along the south wall and said, "He will prepare. Declan Merrow has never run from anything in his life. It is one of the things I trusted about him." She heard the past tense. She did not say anything about it. She walked back toward the door. He walked beside her, and outside the air smelled like the sea and diesel and the specific cold of a port in late October. And neither of them said anything on the walk back to the car, because there was nothing that needed to be said that was not already understood. In the car on the way back, she looked at the side of his face and thought about the conversation in the office before they left, about the photograph and the version he had described and the way he had said, "I believe you." She thought about the fact that he had told her directly, had shown her the photograph and told her what it looked like and given her the chance to explain, rather than acting on the worst interpretation without telling her. She thought about Vincent Doyle, who had never once given her the chance to explain anything, who had simply applied pressure and observed the result and applied more pressure. She thought about the difference between those two things and what the difference meant. She did not have a word for what it meant. She had a feeling for it, which was new for her in relation to another person, and which she would continue not having a word for until much later when it would not need one. Declan Merrow arrived at the warehouse at 5:58 in the morning, 4 minutes before the time Ren had given him. He came alone, which told Cass everything about what he had decided overnight. A man who intended to run would have sent someone else, or not appeared at all. A man who intended to fight would have brought people. Declan Merrow came alone because he had done the math. The same kind of math she had done in a parking structure 11 days ago, and had arrived at the conclusion that there was only one version of this morning that ended with his daughter protected, and that version required him to be here without leverage, without backup, and without the option of making this worse than it already was. She understood that calculation. She had made versions of it herself. She was not supposed to be here. Ren had told her at 11 the previous night, in the car outside her building, that she was done. The warehouse visit was complete. Her identification of the documentation was on record. Her part in this was finished. He had said it with the specific finality of someone who has made a decision about another person's safety and is not inviting discussion. She had said, "All right." She had gone upstairs. She had stood at the port window for 40 minutes and thought about Declan Merrow arriving at a warehouse to face the consequence of 18 months of choices made under conditions she understood better than most people would. And she had thought about the 9 invoices in a folder in her desk drawer. And she had thought about what the diagram she had built looked like from Declan's side. A structure dismantled by someone he had never seen coming. She had thought about all of this, and then she had gone back downstairs and walked the 12 blocks to the warehouse because she had information that was relevant to what was going to happen in that building, and she was not a person who sat in an apartment while relevant information went unused. Ren saw her when she came through the service entrance, and his expression did exactly one thing, which was a single degree of movement at the jaw that meant he had expected this and had prepared for it, and was not going to address it here. She stood against the wall to his left and did not speak. He looked at her for one more second, and then looked at the door, which opened a moment later. Declan walked in. He saw Ren. He saw the 2 men flanking the south wall. He saw Cass. He looked at Cass for a long moment, longer than he looked at anyone else in the room, and she understood from the quality of that look that he had known from the moment the invoices were found who had found them. Not her name. But what? She was the person from outside, with no history in the system and no reason not to see what was there. He said, "You." Not a question, not an accusation, just recognition. She said, "Yes." He nodded once. The same kind of nod she had given Ren in the office 2 nights ago. The nod of someone accepting a fact they cannot change. Ren said, "Tell me about the facility. All of it, starting from the beginning." Declan looked at him. He said, "I need one thing first." Ren said, "Your daughter." Declan said, "She had nothing to do with this. She does not know anything. She is 23 years old, and she has been in a hospital in Geneva for 2 years, and she does not know what I did to pay for it." His voice was even, but there was something under the evenness that Cass had heard once before, in a different context. The sound of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally put it down in a room with other people present. Ren said, "She will not be touched. That is the only promise I am making today." Declan looked at him for a long moment. He said, "Then I will tell you everything." He began, and what he described was not what Cass had imagined from the invoices, which was a calculated scheme built from ambition or greed. What he described was the specific shape of a decision made at 3 a.m. in a hospital waiting room in Geneva, when a doctor had told him that his daughter's treatment was available and effective and would cost more money than he had ever seen in one place. And a man had appeared beside him in that waiting room 2 days later, with a card and a phone number, and a very specific kind of offer. He had said no. He had said no a second time, 3 weeks later, when the man appeared again. He had said yes the third time, 4 months later, when the treatment was working and the bill had come due, and he had nothing left to sell. He said, "I told myself it was 1 shipment. Then it was 1 more. Then the bills kept coming, and the shipments kept coming, and I had been doing it for 6 months before I understood that there was no point at which it would stop." He said this to Ren, not to the room, with the directness of someone who has decided that the only thing left is to be entirely clear. He said, "I am sorry. I know what that is worth. I am telling you anyway." Ren said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Where is the contact? The man who approached you in Geneva." Declan gave him a name. He gave him an address. He gave him the details of the next scheduled transfer, which was in 11 days, which meant there was time to intercept it through channels that would not require the kind of federal involvement that would put Declan in a room with prosecutors rather than with Ren. He gave all of this without being asked for each piece separately. He understood that this was the only way the promise held. Then Declan reached inside his jacket. Ren's 2 men moved. Cass moved too, without thinking, stepping away from the wall and forward, into the open space of the warehouse floor between Declan and Ren. She did not know why she moved. She moved because she was already moving, because her body had decided that something was about to change in the room and had responded before she could assess it. Declan's hand came out of his jacket with a phone, not a weapon, and he looked at Cass, standing between him and Ren, with an expression that was complicated in a way she would think about later. The expression of a man who has just seen something he was not expecting and who is, despite everything, briefly glad to have seen it. He set the phone on the crate beside him. He said, "The contact's number. The last 12 months of messages." He stepped back. He put his hands where they could be seen. He said, "I am done." What happened in the next 40 seconds happened faster than her ability to reconstruct it in sequence. Ren's 2 men moved toward Declan. Declan did not resist, but one of the men moved at an angle that brought him close to the crates along the south wall, and a crate shifted, and the edge of it caught Ren across the forearm as he stepped forward to manage the position of the room. and she heard the sound it made, which was brief and specific. And she saw him pull his arm back and hold it against his side and keep moving, keep managing the room, keep doing everything that needed doing, without stopping or making a sound about it, which she noted was impressive and also unnecessary because the situation was resolved and he was bleeding through his sleeve. 20 minutes later, the warehouse was empty of everything except the two of them and the crates, which would be handled by people who had been called and were on their way. Ren was sitting on the edge of a wooden pallet with his jacket off and his sleeve rolled up and a cut along his forearm that was not deep but was present and still bleeding with the persistence of cuts in locations that moved. She was kneeling in front of him with the first aid kit from the emergency panel on the warehouse wall, which she had found in the first 30 seconds of the aftermath because finding useful things in unfamiliar environments was a skill she had developed without naming it. She was not asking him if he was fine. He was clearly not fine in the specific and limited way of a person with a bleeding forearm, and asking him if he was fine would have been a question about something else entirely, which she was not ready to ask. She cleaned the cut and applied the closure strips from the kit and wrapped the gauze around it with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, which she had, twice, for reasons she did not explain. He watched her work. He said, "You were not supposed to be here." She said, "I know." She pressed the gauze down and held it. He said, "You came anyway." She said, "I had information that was relevant to what was going to happen in this building." He said, "You could have sent it with one of my men." She looked up at him. She said, "Yes." She looked back down at the gauze. She said, "I did not want to." He was quiet. She finished the wrap and tied it off and sat back on her heels and looked at her work. He said, "Cass." She looked up. He said, "I have been doing this for a long time. The work I do, the kind of person it requires me to be." He held her gaze. "I am not going to pretend otherwise or tell you that the parts you have not seen are better than the parts you have seen. They are not." She said, "I know." He said, "I am telling you so you understand the full thing, not just what happens in offices and warehouses." She looked at him, at the wrapped forearm and the face that was currently showing more than it usually showed, which was still less than most people showed on an ordinary Tuesday. And she thought about 11 days, about parking structures and port windows and ledger entries and photographs and the specific way he had said, "I believe you," in a room where he had not been obligated to say it, where a different person would have acted on the photograph and not said anything at all. She said, "I have seen enough to understand what I am looking at." He said, "And?" She said, "And I am still here." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "That is not a small thing." She said, "No, it is not." She was still sitting in front of him on the warehouse floor. He reached out with his unwrapped hand and touched her face, not urgently, with the specific care of someone who is doing something for the first time and wants to do it correctly. She did not move away. She had spent the past year building distance between herself and everything she could not control, a careful architecture of not being where she could be hurt, and she was aware in this moment that she was dismantling it, deliberately and without a guarantee about what came next, because the alternative was to keep building it, and she had decided somewhere between the parking structure and this warehouse floor that she was finished with that particular structure. She leaned forward. He met her. The kiss was brief and quiet and tasted like the sea air coming in through the warehouse's high windows. And when she pulled back, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said that was not already in the room, which was different from nothing to say and was, she thought, a much better place to start. Outside, the port was running, cranes moving and ships moving, and the constant hydraulic sound of a place that did not stop. She stood up. She offered him her hand to stand. He took it. They walked out of the warehouse together into the early morning light of the port district. And the light was the particular light of a city before it had fully committed to the day. Still cold, still possible, still entirely undecided about what it was going to become.